Teen gives up first-class seat to elderly woman. Her note changes everything. Thank you for being here today. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how stories bring people from all over the world together. Now, let's begin. Jalen Carter had always believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. At 17, he was tall for his age, with neatly twisted hair and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. He carried himself with quiet confidence, a trait he had inherited from his late father, Marcus. Marcus had always told Jalen, kindness doesn't cost a thing, but its value is immeasurable. And now, standing in the bustling airport terminal in Charlotte, North Carolina, Jalen found himself remembering those words once again. His ticket read first class, a surprise that left him stunned. He had never flown anything but economy, and this unexpected upgrade had been a gift from his mentor, Mr. Dawson, as a reward for Jalen's dedication to a summer research project. Jalen was on his way to Portland, Oregon, where he would attend a prestigious youth leadership summit. He had spent months preparing, perfecting his speech, researching discussion topics, and dreaming of meeting other students who, like him, wanted to change the world. But despite his excitement, there was a small knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was just a kid from a modest background, stepping into a level of privilege he wasn't used to. As he made his way down the jet bridge into the first-class cabin, Jalen was momentarily overwhelmed. The lighting was warm and soothing, the seats were spacious and luxurious, and the flight attendants greeted passengers with effortless charm. For a brief second, he hesitated. Would someone look at him and question if he really belonged here? But no one did. He found his assigned seat, 2B, and settled in, awed by the sheer amount of legroom. The seat felt more like a personal lounge chair than anything he'd ever experienced on a plane. He placed his backpack beneath the seat, took a steadying breath, and tried to calm the nerves fluttering in his chest. Around him, most of the passengers were well-dressed professionals, sipping bottled water, scrolling through their phones, or typing away on sleek laptops. Jalen wondered if they even noticed the luxury they were in, or if to them this was just another routine flight. To his right, a man in an expensive navy suit barely acknowledged him. Across the aisle, a woman fussed with an elaborate neck pillow, adjusting it to her liking. Everything about this section of the plane felt foreign, elegant yet distant. Then, something caught Jalen's attention. A frail elderly woman was making her way slowly down the aisle, glancing at the seat numbers with a look of confusion. She leaned on a slim cane, her face lined with age, and her silvery white hair was tied into a careful bun. Her glasses kept slipping down her nose as she shuffled forward. Something about her reminded Jalen of his grandmother, who always visited during the holidays, her purse filled with candy and gentle wisdom. When the elderly woman stopped at an overhead bin and struggled to lift her small carry-on bag, Jalen didn't hesitate. He quickly unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and gave her a polite smile before gesturing to help. She turned to him, startled at first, but then her expression softened with gratitude. "Thank you, dear," she murmured, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Jalen carefully lifted her bag and tucked it into the compartment before watching as she slowly continued her search for her seat. It was near the back, where the space was tight and the noise from the engines would be loud. Jalen felt a pull in his chest. Not pity, something deeper. She deserved better than to be crammed into an uncomfortable middle seat for hours. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head, gently urging him, "Do what you can, when you can." Taking a steadying breath, Jalen gathered his courage and tapped her lightly on the shoulder. "Ma'am," he said kindly, "would you like to switch seats with me? I'm in first class, it's a lot more comfortable." Her eyes widened in shock, and she immediately shook her head. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly accept that, young man." She looked at him as though he had just performed a miracle. But Jalen smiled reassuringly. "I promise I don't mind. I'm young, I can handle a tight seat in the back, but you deserve to be comfortable." The businessman seated next to Jalen gave an annoyed glance at the conversation but said nothing. Still hesitant, the elderly woman studied Jalen's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. But there was none. He truly meant it. After a long pause, her eyes welled with tears. "If you're sure," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sure." They swapped boarding passes and Jalen escorted her to seat 2B, helping her settle in. She lowered herself into the plush seat with a sigh of relief, then turned to him, pressing her hands together in silent gratitude. Jalen just smiled. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." Then, without looking back, he made his way to her original seat in economy. And that was when everything changed. Jalen found himself in the middle section of economy class, squeezed into seat 24C, just a few rows from the restrooms. The space was tight, and as he settled in, he made sure not to accidentally bump the teenager beside him, who was completely absorbed in adjusting his noise-canceling headphones. The overhead bins were nearly full, and the aisle remained packed as passengers jostled for space, stowed their bags, and murmured complaints about limited storage. Despite the crowded atmosphere, Jalen felt an unexpected warmth in his chest, a quiet sense of peace. He had done something good. As the flight attendants secured the overhead compartments and began their safety demonstration, Jalen fastened his seatbelt, exhaled a slow breath, and prepared for takeoff. A soft rumble coursed through the cabin as the plane taxied down the runway. He gazed around at the other passengers. Families juggling restless children, couples whispering about their travel plans, business people immersed in their phones. Jalen thought about how easily everyone had overlooked the elderly woman from earlier. It wasn't that they were unkind. Most people were simply too caught up in their own lives to notice the quiet struggles around them. The engines roared, and the plane lifted off, climbing higher and higher into the sky. From his window seat, Jalen watched the city below shrink into a maze of tiny streets and buildings, the highways weaving like silver threads. His mind drifted. He thought about the leadership summit ahead, the speeches he had practiced, and whether he would truly belong among the other students, many of whom came from backgrounds far more privileged than his own. Then his thoughts turned to his father. Would Marcus be proud of him right now? A wave of emotion tightened Jalen's throat, but he quickly pushed it down. Just as he was lost in his own thoughts, a flight attendant approached his row, a folded piece of paper in her hand. She leaned down and in a hushed voice said, "This is from the lady in first class." Jalen blinked in surprise. He took the note carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. The paper was creased, the handwriting neat and deliberate. He read the words once, then again. "I have something important to tell you. I believe we have met before, though you do not remember me. Please, when we land, let me speak with you. May God bless you for your kindness." Jalen's heart pounded against his ribs. Met before? That couldn't be right. He was almost certain he had never seen this woman in his life, at least not until she had struggled with her bag in the aisle. His mind raced, searching his memory for any recollection of an elderly woman with soft brown eyes and silver hair. But nothing came to him. He read the note again, each word carrying an air of mystery, as if it were the key to a door he hadn't even realized existed. Had she mistaken him for someone else? Or was there something deeper he didn't yet understand? Jalen pressed the note against his chest, feeling a strange mix of excitement, curiosity, and an unshakable sense that this flight had taken an unexpected turn, one that had nothing to do with the destination printed on his boarding pass. He tried to distract himself with music, scrolling through the airline's playlist, but his mind kept drifting back to the note. Every time the flight attendant passed by, he half expected another message, but none came. Instead, time stretched on. Passengers around him carried on with their lives. A mother scolding her teenage daughter in hushed tones, a businessman highlighting pages in a self-help book, an elderly man dozing with his mouth slightly open, a pair of kids giggling over a tablet game. Life was moving forward, unaware of the quiet storm brewing inside Jalen. The note remained folded in his lap, its weight far heavier than the paper itself. When the pilot announced the plane's descent, Jalen felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The final announcements played, the cabin lights brightened, and passengers straightened their seats. The teenager beside him removed his headphones with a lazy yawn, while others quickly gathered their belongings. The tightness of economy class suddenly felt suffocating. Jalen longed for a deep breath of fresh air, but he reminded himself why he was here, why he had given up his seat. It had been the right thing to do. Finally, with a slight jolt, the plane touched down, As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers rushed to their feet, scrambling for overhead bags, forming a slow-moving line in the aisle. Jalen, however, stayed in his seat, watching, waiting. A strange, electric feeling crept up his spine. Something was about to happen. He could feel it, and when it was finally his turn to exit, he stepped forward, not just toward the terminal, but toward whatever awaited him next. Jalen stepped into the jet bridge, scanning the sea of passengers disembarking ahead of him. His heart pounded with anticipation. Then he saw her. The elderly woman stood near the wall, her cane in one hand and her small carry-on in the other. She wasn't in a hurry, she was waiting. Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude, but also something else. Urgency. Jalen hesitated for just a second before walking toward her, unsure of what to say. She greeted him with a soft but steady voice. "I'm Margaret Ellis," she introduced herself, "and I need a few minutes of your time." She thanked him once more for the seat, explaining that the comfort had been a blessing to her aching joints. But as she glanced around, as if ensuring no one else was listening, her expression shifted. "There's something I have to tell you," she murmured. Jalen's stomach tightened. He nodded, his curiosity outweighing his nervousness. They moved through the terminal, eventually finding a quiet corner near the windows. The airport bustled around them, people rushing past, dragging suitcases, greeting loved ones, but in this moment, it felt like the world had slowed. Margaret took a deep breath, gripping her cane. Jalen instinctively reached for her carry-on to lighten her burden, and she let him, her gaze locked on his face as though studying every detail. "I recognized you the moment I saw your eyes," she finally said. Jalen frowned. "But how? We've never met before." Margaret hesitated, as if the weight of her words needed careful handling. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both sorrow and certainty. "I was a nurse," she explained. "A long time ago, at Fort Ridge Medical Base, where your father was stationed before he passed." Jalen's breath caught in his throat. His father. The topic was rarely spoken of outside their home. Few people even knew the details of Marcus Carter's service, let alone his final moments. He stared at Margaret, disbelief swirling inside him. Was this some mistake, some strange coincidence? But then she spoke again, this time with details only someone who had been there could know. Jalen felt a chill ripple down his spine. Margaret's voice trembled as she continued. "I was on duty the night he was brought in. We did everything we could, but he knew. He knew he wouldn't make it." Jalen's hands curled into fists at his sides. He had been just 7 years old when his mother, Danielle, received the news. He still remembered that day, his mother gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white, her face crumbling as she sank onto the couch. The days that followed had been a blur of whispered voices and condolences that felt empty. He had never known exactly how his father's last moments played out, until now. Margaret wiped at her eyes. "Before he passed, he kept saying your name, over and over. 'Jalen, my boy Jalen, he's going to do great things. Watch over him for me. Let him know I love him.'" Jalen's chest tightened painfully. Hearing his father's words he never knew existed, broke something inside him. Tears burned at the edges of his vision, but he didn't move, didn't speak. Margaret swallowed hard. "For years, I carried the weight of that night. I always felt like I failed him because I couldn't save him. And when I heard about his son, so young, with his whole life ahead of him, I wanted to reach out. I tried to find your family, but with military transfers, changes, and records, it was impossible. Eventually, I had to accept that I might never get the chance to tell you." Jalen felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: sorrow, disbelief, and something deeper. He did the only thing that felt right. He pulled Margaret into a hug. She stiffened for just a moment before sinking into the embrace, her frail frame trembling against him. Around them, travelers walked by, unaware of the history unfolding between two strangers bound by a shared past. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. "This," she whispered, pressing it into his hand, "is something your father wanted you to have." Jalen looked down at the envelope, his fingers shaking as he carefully unfolded the aged piece of paper inside. The handwriting wasn't his father's, but it had been written for him. Margaret had transcribed it on his father's behalf when he realized time was running out. Jalen read the words. My dear Jalen, I'm proud of you every single day, even though I may not be there to tell you. Life won't always be easy, but remember, kindness is your strength. Use it wisely, and doors will open that you never imagined possible. Stay true to yourself, believe in who you are, and never, ever doubt how much I love you. A strangled sob escaped Jalen before he could stop it. He clutched the letter to his chest, his father's final words sinking into his soul like sunlight warming frozen ground. Margaret watched him, her own eyes shining. He kept calling for you, she whispered. Right until the very end, he wanted to see you, just one more time. Jalen squeezed his eyes shut, letting the emotions wash over him. His father had never truly left him. And now, for the first time in 10 years, Jalen finally felt like he had a piece of him back. Around them, the airport bustled with movement. Passengers hurried by with rolling suitcases, announcements crackled over the speakers, and children tugged at their parents' hands, whining for snacks. Yet in the midst of all the chaos, Jalen and Margaret remained in their own quiet world, wrapped in a moment of grief and gratitude, connected by a man whose love had transcended time and distance. Margaret sighed, her grip tightening on her cane. I'm sorry for dropping all of this on you so suddenly, she said, her voice laced with emotion. Jalen shook his head. You don't have to apologize, he assured her. If anything, I should be thanking you for holding on to my father's words, for caring enough to find me. Margaret gave a small, sad smile. I never had children of my own, she admitted. Nursing became my whole life. But meeting you today, it feels like closure, like a promise I made long ago is finally being fulfilled. Jalen swallowed hard, absorbing the weight of her words. He thought about how a simple decision, giving up his first-class seat, had led him here, to this moment, had given him a connection to his father he never thought possible. A shiver ran through him, not from fear, but from something bigger. Fate. Faith. The belief that his father was still guiding him, even from beyond. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small slip of paper, handing it to him. My number, she said softly. If you ever need to talk, advice, a listening ear, or just a reminder of your father's kindness. Jalen took it carefully, nodding. I'd like that, he said sincerely. For a brief second, he felt something unexpected. A sense of family. A bond with someone who had been there in his father's final moments, who understood his loss in a way no one else ever could. But time was pressing forward, and soon they had to part ways. Jalen had a connecting flight to Portland, while Margaret needed to meet her niece at baggage claim. Their goodbye was quiet, filled with meaning neither had the words to express. As she disappeared into the crowd, Jalen found himself standing still, the letter still clutched in his hands. He exhaled deeply, then found a quiet bench and unfolded the note once more, rereading each line, as if trying to commit every word to memory. Then carefully, he folded it back up and tucked it into his wallet, deciding it would stay there, close to him, always. Walking through the airport, searching for his next gate, Jalen felt different. Gone was the boy who had once hesitated, questioning whether he belonged in first class. His father's words echoed in his heart. Kindness is the measure of a man, not wealth or status. And Jalen had unknowingly followed in his father's footsteps, choosing service, compassion, and selflessness. By the time he reached his next gate, he no longer felt nervous about the Youth Leadership Summit. This wasn't just an event anymore. It was a mission. A chance to share his father's message with others who might be searching for their own purpose. A chance to remind them that sometimes the smallest act of kindness leads to the most extraordinary discoveries. Jalen's next flight was boarding soon, and as he found his assigned seat in economy, he noticed the woman beside him. A middle-aged traveler with kind eyes and a warm smile. She introduced herself as Linda, mentioning she was headed to a business conference. Noticing the moisture in Jalen's eyes, she hesitated before asking gently, "Are you all right?" Normally, Jalen wasn't one to share personal things with strangers, but something about Linda's presence felt safe. So for the first time, he spoke about what had just happened. He told her about the woman he had met, the nurse who had been with his father in his last moments. Linda listened intently, her expression soft with understanding. Then she shared her own story. Years ago, when she was at her lowest, a stranger had shown her an unexpected kindness. That one simple act had changed her life's course, inspiring her to adopt 2 foster children, giving them the love and stability they had never known. Jalen felt a deep sense of connection as they talked. Different lives, different experiences. Yet the same lesson. Kindness ripples through time, reaching far beyond what we can see. By the time they landed in Portland, he and Linda exchanged numbers, promising to stay in touch. Jalen stepped off the plane with a renewed sense of purpose. The airport was alive with energy, and as he walked toward the youth leadership seminar check-in area, he saw students from all over the country. Some had name tags and registration packets. Others carried guitars or wore shirts with slogans supporting causes they believed in. The air buzzed with possibility. Jalen joined the check-in line, feeling both nervous and excited. When he introduced himself to a few students, their faces lit up as they talked about their projects. One was creating a community garden to feed the homeless, another had started an online platform for mental health awareness, and someone else was organizing coding workshops for underprivileged kids. Each one had a dream. Each one was fueled by the same thing, a desire to make a difference. And Jalen knew, now more than ever, that his father's words weren't just meant for him. They were meant to be shared. Jalen sat in a packed seminar room, surrounded by young leaders eager to learn. The day had been filled with workshops on leadership development, public speaking, conflict resolution, and inclusive initiatives. Each speaker shared stories of resilience, triumphs, and failures that shaped their journeys. One session, however, struck Jalen on a deeper level. The discussion focused on racial bias in communities, how prejudice often appears in subtle ways, and how youth leaders could work to dismantle harmful stereotypes. As he listened, something inside him stirred. He had lived this reality. Growing up as a young black man, he knew what it felt like to be watched too closely in a store, to have teachers underestimate his abilities, to sense mistrust in places where he had done nothing wrong. But this session wasn't about anger, it was about action. About breaking barriers through education, conversation, and compassion. Jalen took notes, absorbing new strategies, ways to challenge bias constructively, create meaningful dialogue, and inspire change from within. Even as the conversation continued, part of his mind drifted to Margaret. Had her niece picked her up safely? Did she feel the same sense of peace that he did after their unexpected reunion? During a short break, Jalen pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. "Thank you again for the letter, Margaret. I've arrived safely. I can't tell you how much today has meant to me." He didn't expect a reply right away. She was likely busy with family, but he felt compelled to reach out. Returning to the seminar, Jalen joined a small discussion circle where students shared community-building projects they were passionate about. When it was his turn, he introduced his idea, a kindness network, a program that would encourage students to commit to small, intentional acts of compassion each day, helping a struggling classmate, standing up for someone being bullied, assisting a teacher after class, small acts that, over time, could transform a school's culture. As he spoke, he saw heads nodding. Some students jotted down notes, excited about how they could bring the idea to their own schools. Jalen felt the energy shift. This was more than just an idea. It was a movement waiting to happen. Later at lunch, Jalen found himself in conversation with Maya, a passionate artist who wanted to use murals to bring communities together. They bonded over the idea that art and kindness were universal languages, powerful tools that could bridge divides across race, class, and background. Maya listened intently as Jalen shared his thoughts, and in return, she offered ideas on how he could frame his initiative as a story, how storytelling could inspire action. It was an exchange of creativity, driven by shared hope. That afternoon, Jalen's phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. "Thank you for reaching out, dear Jalen. I'm proud of you. Keep shining your light. Your father is with you always." Jalen exhaled deeply, rereading her words. His heart swelled. He typed back a simple promise. "I will, Miss Margaret, I promise." As the day wound down, a keynote speaker, a well-respected activist, took the stage. She spoke with passion about bridging racial divides and how real change starts from within. She reminded them that courage wasn't just found in big historic moments. It was in the small choices. A single act of kindness could spark a ripple effect, spreading further than they could ever imagine. Jalen sat in the front row, hanging on to every word. He thought about the airplane seat he had given up. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than an instinctive gesture of kindness. But it had led him here, to discovering his father's final words, to finding new purpose in his own life, to turning pain into a legacy of compassion. That evening, back at the dorm-style accommodations for seminar attendees, Jalen settled onto his small bed, exhausted but inspired. His roommate, David, was a soft-spoken musician from Chicago, passionate about incorporating music therapy into schools. As they talked, Jalen found himself opening up about his father's military service. Though he didn't share every detail of what had happened that day, he spoke about how learning the truth had changed him. David listened, nodding in understanding. Together, they talked late into the night about how grief, hope, and ambition could be transformed into something tangible, something that made the world better. By the time they fell asleep, Jalen felt lighter. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but it had found a new purpose. The next morning brought new seminars and new conversations. Jalen's mind buzzed with ideas. During a workshop on storytelling for social impact, he shared the story of his first-class seat, how a single moment of kindness had led to discovering his father's final message. The room fell silent as he spoke. Every person hung on to his words. Some wiped away tears. Others nodded, deeply moved. The workshop leader commended him, reminding everyone that true leadership doesn't start with big, dramatic moments. It starts with small acts of kindness. And as Jalen looked around, seeing how his story had touched others, he realized something powerful. This wasn't just his father's message. It was now his own. Some participants in the workshop wiped away tears. Others simply nodded, absorbing the magnitude of fate and empathy colliding. The session leader smiled, looking at Jalen with admiration. "This," she said, "is what real leadership looks like. It doesn't start with grand speeches or high positions. It starts with small, simple acts of kindness." A wave of applause filled the room. Jalen sat in quiet reflection, humbled but also emboldened. He had always thought of kindness as just something people should do, like a moral obligation. But now, he realized it was so much more. It was a seed. A single gesture could grow into something greater than anyone could ever predict. As the applause died down, participants began sharing their own stories, moments where kindness had changed the course of their lives. For a while, the workshop became a space of vulnerability and connection. People spoke about the hardships they had faced, the unexpected kindness of strangers, and how small acts had shaped their futures. Jalen listened, amazed at how compassion could build invisible bridges between people from different backgrounds, experiences, and struggles. After the session ended, a boy with soft brown eyes and hesitant movements approached Jalen. "My name's Elijah," he said, his voice shaky. Jalen noticed the nervous energy in him, how his hands twitched slightly, how he hesitated before speaking again. I have a stutter," Elijah admitted, "and sometimes it feels like people don't see me, like my voice doesn't matter." He swallowed, eyes shining with emotion. "But hearing your story, it made me feel like maybe people will listen." Jalen felt a lump in his throat. He clapped a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Your voice does matter," he said firmly. "And the people who truly care will listen. Not just to your words, but to the heart behind them." Elijah gave a small, grateful nod. Jalen knew in that moment that this was what leadership looked like. Not just in speeches or big ideas, but in quiet moments of encouragement. That evening, the seminar hosted a social event, offering a chance for participants to relax, connect, and bond outside of workshops. Jalen wandered through the lively space, pausing to chat with new friends about everything from pop culture to deeper conversations on race, community, and change. The sense of unity in the room was tangible. At one of the tables, he spotted Maya, the artist he had met earlier, painting a quick portrait of another attendee. He watched as her brushstrokes moved with precision, her concentration unwavering. There was something beautiful about it, about how each person in the room had a unique gift, a different piece of the puzzle needed to build a better world. Before heading back to his dorm, Jalen stepped outside into the courtyard where string lights cast a warm glow against the night sky. He found a secluded bench and sat down, gazing up at the endless spread of stars. A gentle breeze ruffled his hair, and in that quiet moment, he felt something. His father. Not physically, not in any way that could be explained, but in the air, in the stillness, in the feeling deep in his chest. Like Marcus Carter was sitting beside him, proud and content. Jalen closed his eyes, replaying the moment on the plane in his mind. Margaret's struggling figure, the spontaneous decision to forfeit comfort for kindness, the note that had changed everything. And he realized there was so much more to do, so much more kindness to spread. Later that night, Jalen called home. He gave his mother, Danielle, a condensed version of everything that had happened. She listened in stunned silence before finally speaking, her voice thick with emotion. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never knew your father got to speak before he was gone. I never knew he left a message for you." Jalen could hear the tears in her voice, and he realized that this had given her something too. A closure she never knew she needed. She made him promise to stay in touch with Margaret, to keep her as part of their lives. Jalen agreed without hesitation. When he hung up the phone, his heart felt lighter. His father's story wasn't finished. Jalen was going to carry it forward. On the last day of the seminar, participants were invited to present their action plans, the ideas they would take back to their communities. Jalen stood before a packed auditorium of students and facilitators. He took a steadying breath and laid out his vision. A nationwide kindness coalition. A network of student leaders working together to normalize acts of empathy. Through school clubs, social media campaigns, partnerships, and motivational assemblies. The goal? To prove that kindness wasn't weakness, that small actions could shift entire cultures. The idea was ambitious, but as he spoke, he saw faces light up, students nodding, a spark igniting in the crowd. And when he finished, the applause was deafening. People weren't just excited, they were ready to join him. After the session, a local news reporter approached him. "I heard your story during the workshop," she said. "I'd love to do an interview with you." Jalen's heart skipped a beat. Public speaking was one thing, but being on the news? That was a whole different level. Still, he thought of his father's words, "Stay true to who you are." Gathering his courage, he agreed. As the camera rolled, Jalen spoke candidly about what had happened, about how a simple decision on an airplane had led him to discover a missing piece of his father's story. He talked about kindness, about how it had reshaped his perspective, about why it was the core principle of everything he wanted to build. The reporter seemed genuinely moved. "In a world filled with negativity, stories like yours remind us that humanity still has the capacity for grace," she said. Then she asked him, "What would you say to young people who feel powerless, who are afraid to stand out?" Jalen thought for a moment. Then he answered, "Courage doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. It can be as small as a single act of kindness, because you never know how far that act will reach." Jalen wrapped up his interview with a final thought. A single act of kindness can create a ripple effect far greater than we ever imagine. Sometimes, all it takes is reaching out to someone, standing up for what's right, or listening when someone's voice shakes with uncertainty. With that, the interview ended, leaving him feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed. That evening, the youth leadership seminar concluded with a closing ceremony. Awards were handed out, participants exchanged contact information, hugging and promising to stay in touch. Jalen was amazed at how quickly these strangers had become friends. The energy in the room was filled with something intangible, hope. Maya invited him to collaborate on a mural project in the future. David asked if he'd visit Chicago to speak at a community center he was working with. Elijah gave him a fist bump, grinning as he said he was going to start a kindness club at his school, and that Jalen would be his inspiration. Jalen walked out of the seminar buzzing with excitement. So many possibilities lay ahead. Outside, he hailed a taxi to the budget-friendly hotel he had booked for one extra night in Portland before flying home. As he settled into his room, he checked his phone. A message from Margaret awaited him. "Praying for you always. Remember, one candle can light another, and the flame only grows." Jalen smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He typed back, "Thank you, Miss Margaret. The flame is growing every day." That night, as he lay in bed, Jalen reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. He thought about the nervous boy who'd boarded that first flight, unsure if he belonged in first class. Now, he realized belonging had nothing to do with status or wealth. It was about living with purpose. About choosing kindness. A wave of appreciation washed over him. He mentally thanked Mr. Dawson, the mentor who had surprised him with the first-class ticket. He vowed to pay that kindness forward. The chain of compassion wouldn't stop with him. The next morning, before heading to the airport, Jalen decided to take a walk through a nearby park. The air was crisp, and the sky was painted in soft hues of pink and gold. As he strolled along the winding paths, he noticed couples jogging together, dog walkers pausing to chat, a flock of birds gliding over a shimmering pond. The peaceful scene was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions inside him. His mind drifted back to the note from Margaret, the simple piece of paper that had changed everything. He wondered, how many other moments in life had he overlooked? How many opportunities for connection had passed by simply because he wasn't paying attention? After a few minutes of reflection, he made his way back to the hotel, grabbed his luggage, and headed for the airport. At the terminal, Jalen navigated the lines with a newfound sense of calm and confidence. As he reached his gate, he noticed a frazzled mother struggling to calm her two small children. One child was crying over a lost toy. The other tugged at her sleeve relentlessly. People passed by, casting impatient glances, but no one stopped to help. Jalen felt a familiar tug in his heart. Without hesitation, he knelt beside the children and smiled. "Hey, do you two like coloring?" he asked gently. Their sniffles paused as they looked at him with curiosity. Reaching into his backpack, Jalen pulled out a small notebook and a pack of markers, left over from the seminar. He handed them to the kids, who instantly brightened, their attention shifting from their distress to drawing shapes and doodles. The mother exhaled in relief, looking at Jalen with gratitude in her eyes. She mouthed a silent thank you, and he simply nodded, smiling back. Once again, he was reminded of something so simple, yet so profound. It doesn't take much to ease someone else's burden. The flight boarded soon after, and Jalen found his seat in economy. But this time, he didn't feel out of place. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let himself absorb everything that had happened. The plane soared into the sky, and once again he pulled out his father's letter, unfolding the worn paper with care. He read the words slowly, letting them sink deeper into his soul. Kindness is your strength. Use it wisely, and the world will open doors you never imagined. He whispered the words to himself, etching them into his heart. Arriving in Atlanta was bittersweet. Part of him ached to leave behind the energy of the seminar, the friendships, and the whirlwind of inspiration. But he also felt ready to take what he had learned and bring it home. As he stepped into the arrivals area, he saw his mother, Danielle, waiting with open arms. A broad smile spread across his face as he rushed toward her, wrapping her in a warm embrace. She pulled back, searching his face eagerly. "Tell me everything," she said, her eyes filled with curiosity and pride. Jalen laughed. "I will, once we get home." Together, they walked out of the airport. The weight of his father's memory mingled with the excitement of new beginnings. Over the next few days, Jalen threw himself into his new mission. He began turning his kindness coalition into a reality, reaching out to teachers and school administrators, explaining his vision. Some immediately supported the idea, offering to sponsor a club or introduce him to other student leaders who might help. And just like that, the ripple effect had begun. Jalen continued working with other student leaders, shaping the Kindness Coalition into something real. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations, especially about racial bias and how intentional acts of inclusion could help break down prejudices. He believed in honesty, dialogue, and action. His mother, Danielle, supported him every step of the way. She helped him craft emails, organize materials, and brainstorm outreach ideas. And in doing so, something beautiful happened. Her heart grew lighter. She saw reflections of Marcus in Jalen, his drive, his passion, his commitment to doing good. It gave her comfort. Word spread quickly. At first, students were drawn to the Kindness Coalition simply because it was a unique idea. But as they learned more, they genuinely connected with its purpose. They saw that this wasn't just about looking good on a college application. It was about choosing to care. A friend from his church offered to design a website. A classmate from the debate team helped write PR articles for the local newspaper. Day by day, the project grew from a dream into a structured initiative. Jalen knew that if they did this right, the coalition could expand beyond their school, maybe even statewide or nationally. Whenever he spoke about his motivation, he always credited two people, Margaret and his father. He told their story not for sympathy, but to remind others that life's biggest lessons often come in the smallest, most unexpected moments. He had come to believe something deeply. Racial bias, grief, and the complexities of human relationships could all be softened by one thing: genuine empathy. And in a world that often felt divided, this message was more important than ever. But not everyone supported his vision. Some classmates dismissed his efforts as idealistic nonsense, saying it wouldn't change anything. Others accused him of being self-righteous, claiming he was using his father's story for attention. Jalen felt the sting of those words, but he didn't let them stop him. Whenever doubt crept in, he pulled out his father's letter, rereading the words that had become his anchor. Stay true to who you are. He clung to that truth, because he knew that not everyone would understand. But that couldn't stop him from trying. He also faced subtle racism from people who questioned how a black teenager could possibly lead a movement like this. They doubted his abilities. They whispered about his motives. Some even mocked the way he spoke. But for every door that prejudice tried to close, Jalen found a way around it. He leaned on the people who believed in him, and through every challenge, he learned something valuable. Leadership isn't just about inspiring others. It's about facing the hard truths, both about the world and about your own resilience. Through it all, Margaret remained a steady presence in his life. They exchanged frequent phone calls and texts. She kept him updated on her health, and he shared the coalition's progress. She was overjoyed at how far his vision was reaching. Your father would be so proud, she often told him. Sometimes their conversations drifted back to the military hospital, the sterile white corridors where heartbreak and healing collided every day. Jalen asked questions about his father, things he had never thought to ask before. And Margaret filled in the missing pieces. She told stories of a younger Marcus Carter, the man who spent his free time reading to injured soldiers, offering a listening ear when they needed one. Even in war, his father had found ways to serve others. Each story lit a new candle in Jalen's heart, adding warmth to the growing tapestry of his father's memory. After weeks of planning, the Kindness Coalition's first major event arrived, Kindness Day. The energy in the school was electric. Workshops were set up, local organizations were invited, volunteers signed up to help. Danielle even baked cupcakes shaped like hearts to pass out at the event. Administrators supported the initiative, and community members donated supplies. The excitement was palpable. The morning of the event, students poured into the auditorium. Banners hung from the walls, and at the registration table, participants were given colorful wristbands that read, "Kindness unites us." Jalen stood backstage, taking a deep breath as he prepared to step onto the stage. His knees shook slightly. He wasn't afraid of public speaking. He had done it before. But this was different. This was personal. Scanning the audience, he caught sight of his mother, beaming with pride. Then, near the front row, he saw Margaret. She had taken 2 buses and a rideshare service just to be here. Her cane rested beside her chair. And though the journey had clearly tired her, her expression was filled with nothing but pride and encouragement. The sight of her filled Jalen with courage. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. The room fell silent, and he began to speak. He talked about compassion, how small, simple acts could lead to extraordinary outcomes. He shared how a single decision on an airplane had led him to a story he never knew existed. He spoke about racial bias, about how breaking stereotypes wasn't about anger but about building bridges. Then, to conclude, he did something he had never done before. He read an excerpt from his father's letter. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke the words into the microphone, allowing them to fill the space. Kindness is your strength. Use it wisely, and the world will open doors you never imagined. When he finished, the room was silent, a hushed, reverent pause. Then, thunderous applause. Some people stood, others wiped away tears. And from the front row, Margaret smiled through misty eyes, nodding with quiet pride. Jalen closed his eyes for just a second, letting the moment sink in. His father's story hadn't ended with loss. it had continued. Through him. Through all of them. And he knew, deep in his heart, that this was just the beginning. Margaret wiped her cheeks, a soft smile spreading across her face, one filled with both pride and relief. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of connection and purpose. Students moved through interactive stations on empathy, conflict resolution, and cultural awareness. Volunteers gathered donations for the local food bank. Teachers, some of whom had been indifferent at first, found themselves deeply moved by the unity they witnessed. Even the skeptics, those who had dismissed Jalen's vision as naive, couldn't help but be swept up in the energy of kindness, if only for the day. By the time the event wrapped up, Jalen was exhausted, but jubilant. He collapsed onto a chair backstage, his heart pounding with excitement. Then, he heard the soft tap of a cane on the floor. Margaret made her way toward him, her steps slow but determined. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did something truly special today." Then she pulled him into a gentle hug. As she leaned back, she pressed a small envelope into his hands. Jalen frowned, confused, but carefully tore it open. Inside was a photograph. His father, Marcus Carter, in uniform. Standing beside him in the hospital corridor was a younger Margaret, dressed in her nurse's scrubs. His breath caught in his throat. He turned the photo over, and there, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, was a note. "For my dear Jalen, so you can always see your father's light in all that you do." Jalen stared at the image, absorbing every detail. His father's strong build, his warm, unwavering smile, the same determined expression that Jalen often saw in the mirror. He looked back at Margaret, eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll cherish this forever." She squeezed his hand. "I know you will." As the success of Kindness Day echoed through the halls, Jalen realized this was only the beginning. He had a mission now. Not just to grow the Kindness Coalition, but to create resources that other schools could use, to keep spreading the message, to ensure that kindness didn't just exist for a single day, but became a movement. Over the next few months, the coalition's impact expanded beyond their school. Local media picked up the story. Community leaders invited Jalen to speak at gatherings. Donations poured in for future projects. Other schools began hosting their own Kindness Days, reaching out to collaborate with Jalen's group. Eventually, a national youth leadership organization took notice, inviting him to present at a regional conference. Each milestone felt like proof. Proof that giving up his first-class seat on that flight had set something extraordinary in motion. Yet Jalen never saw himself as the center of it all. Whenever interviewed, he always returned to the same message: small gestures ignite vast networks of goodness. He always credited two people: his father, whose legacy had shaped him, and Margaret, who had carried that legacy across time. He emphasized that anyone, regardless of their background, could become an agent of change. He spoke openly about the barriers society built: racial bias, poverty, isolation. But he also spoke about something stronger: the collective tide of kindness that could wash those barriers away. Through it all, Margaret followed his progress from afar. Their phone calls became more frequent. She grew frailer, but her spirit remained unshaken. One brisk autumn afternoon, she called him. Her voice trembled slightly. "The doctors, they found something." Jalen sat up straight, alarm gripping his chest. But before he could speak, she gently reassured him. "I've had a full, beautiful life. I'm at peace." She paused. "But I'd love to see you again, dear. Soon." Jalen didn't hesitate. He asked his mother, Danielle, if they could visit. She agreed without question. The very next day, they drove 2 hours to the hospital where Margaret was being treated. Walking into the room, Jalen's breath hitched. Margaret lay in the hospital bed, frail against the white sheets. But her eyes still held the same kindness. She smiled weakly, motioning for him to come closer. Jalen took her hand, noticing how thin and delicate it felt, how the veins pressed gently against her skin. "I am so proud of you," she whispered. Her fingers squeezed his. "You have become the kind of man your father always knew you'd be." Jalen swallowed hard, blinking back tears. She looked up at him, eyes soft. "Don't fear the future," she murmured, "even if it means losing me." His throat tightened. Though their bond was new, it had been forged in something deeper than time. She represented both closure and continuity in his story. With Danielle standing nearby, Margaret began to recount the same story she had told Jalen before. Only this time her voice was weaker, slower. She spoke again of Marcus Carter, of his final moments, of his unwavering love for his son. She smiled faintly as she described the last thing she remembered. The gentle, peaceful expression Marcus wore as he drifted into eternal rest, secure in the belief that his son would live out the values he had taught him. Jalen soaked in every detail. Each word was a precious fragment of his father, a piece of his story he had never had before. They sat together for an hour, sometimes laughing over small memories, sometimes weeping over the weight of it all. Finally, Margaret's eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion setting in. Jalen squeezed her hand gently. "I'll carry on the mission," he whispered. Danielle stepped forward, brushing Margaret's hair back from her forehead, offering soft words of comfort. And in that moment, the lines of race, age, and circumstance disappeared. They were just people, bound by love, by legacy, by the unbreakable power of kindness. A few days later, Margaret was discharged, choosing to spend her final days at home, surrounded by family. Jalen checked in as often as he could. Between balancing school, the Kindness Coalition, and life, he made time. Because Margaret had given him something irreplaceable, a connection to his father, a mission to keep going, and a reminder that love never truly fades. Months later, as Jalen stood on a stage at the regional youth conference, he took a deep breath before speaking. In the crowd were hundreds of young leaders, dreamers, and changemakers. He told them about the power of a single act of kindness, how giving up his first-class seat had led him here, how small moments carry immeasurable impact. He finished with the words that had guided him through it all. "Kindness is your strength. Use it wisely, and the world will open doors you never imagined." As applause thundered around him, Jalen closed his eyes for just a moment. He could feel them there. His father, Margaret. Their light, and he smiled, because he knew the mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. In that moment, as Jalen sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, the usual barriers of race, age, and background faded away. They were simply two human beings, bound by love, compassion, and the invisible thread of a shared history. Days later, Margaret was discharged. She chose to spend her remaining time in the comfort of her home, surrounded by the memories she had gathered over a lifetime. Jalen continued to check on her frequently, balancing his schoolwork, the Kindness Coalition, and visits to her small but welcoming home. Each time she greeted him, it was with the warmth of family, and Jalen felt the same in return. But with each visit, he noticed the quiet changes in her health, the tiredness in her bones, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her tea. Still, Margaret never stopped encouraging him. During one of their final visits, she surprised him with a small wooden trunk. Inside were pieces of her past. A battered journal filled with her handwritten notes from decades of nursing, a few military medals given to her for service, old photographs of the soldiers she had cared for, of moments she had cherished. She looked at him, her voice soft but firm. "I want you to have these, Jalen." He swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "These are the stories of the people I cared for, the lessons of empathy, resilience, and love that shaped my life." Jalen ran his fingers over the worn edges of the journal, realizing she was passing the torch. She was entrusting him with the responsibility of carrying those stories forward. Time moved forward, relentless and unstoppable. And then, on a cold winter morning, the call came. Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Even though Jalen had known it was coming, the loss still stunned him. He wept openly, mourning not just her passing, but the deep connection they had shared. His mother, Danielle, held him close, reminding him that Margaret's spirit lived on, not just in his heart, but in the kindness he carried into the world. In the weeks that followed, Jalen organized a memorial service at Margaret's church. It was a gathering of lives she had touched, neighbors, nurses, soldiers she had once cared for, members of the Kindness Coalition, students who had never met her but had been moved by her story. As Jalen stood before them, delivering the eulogy, he spoke not of loss, but of connection. He shared how a simple moment on an airplane had led him to a life-altering bond. He spoke of the letter from his father, the words that had guided him. And he honored Margaret, the nurse who had carried his father's final message across time, ensuring it would never be lost. By the end, the room was silent, the weight of her legacy hanging in the air. Then slowly people stood, clapping softly. The memorial ended not in sorrow, but in hope, a testament to the kind of life Margaret had lived. Despite his grief, Jalen left the church that day more convinced than ever that life's fragility only made kindness more important. That the legacy we leave is not in what we accumulate, but in the love we invest in others. Margaret and his father had both taught him this, and now it was his turn to carry it forward. As the years passed, Jalen poured himself into that mission. He finished high school and went on to college, studying social work and community development. The Kindness Coalition expanded into a national nonprofit, rallying young leaders across the country. He traveled to conferences, gave speeches, led workshops, always carrying his father's letter and Margaret's photograph in his wallet. They were his compass, guiding him through every challenge, every doubt. He never forgot the day he gave up his first-class seat. Whenever people asked about it, he told the story without fanfare, simply as proof that a fleeting moment of kindness could lead to life's most extraordinary gifts. Jalen built a life around that belief. He formed relationships with countless people, students, activists, everyday strangers, who found solace in his story. The boy who had once felt out of place in first class had become a beacon for those searching for a more compassionate world. Years later, on the anniversary of Margaret's passing, Jalen found himself back at an airport, a ticket in hand, preparing to board another flight, this time for yet another speaking engagement. As he stood near the gate, he scanned the terminal, his eyes searching. Not for a seat, not for luxury, but for a moment, for someone in need, for the next act of kindness waiting to unfold. He thought of Margaret, her cane, her wise eyes, her unwavering generosity. He thought of his father, the man who had never stopped believing in him, and he felt them both close, smiling, encouraging him forward. In that moment, Jalen understood something more deeply than ever before. No seat, no status, no difference in background could ever overshadow the boundless power of a kind heart. He whispered a silent promise into the air that he would always remain open to those small, quiet moments, the ones that held the potential to change lives forever. Then, with boarding pass in hand, he stepped forward, ready for whatever awaited him next, carrying love's legacy to wherever he was called next.